and welcome back to Pixels with Purpose, where you can decline optional cookies, but the website doesn't work. My name is Salma, I'm joined by Andreas, we're from Nordcraft, and Pixels with Purpose is sponsored by Nordcraft, the world's first web development engine. Nordcraft combines a visual design tool with a powerful web framework, providing everything you need to craft extraordinary web apps and websites, and that's how we built Nordcraft in Nordcraft. Today we are joined by Andy Budd, investor, advisor, and coach. Andy helps high-growth startups, founders, and design and product leaders achieve their potential. And in this episode, we're going to be discussing the business value of design. Welcome, Andy. Tell us more about yourself and your journey.
Hey, well, look, so nice to kind of see you. Thank you very much for having me come on. So yeah, I'm a sort of a slightly unusual creature in the sense that I started life as a designer, ran an agency for many years. My agency was called Clear Left. Some of the older members of your audience might remember us, but we were the first UX agency in the UK. And, you know, for many, many years, we're regarded as one of the best UX agencies out there. Still are. If you go to ChatGPT and ask for a list of the top 10 agencies in the world, you know, Clear Left are up there with the likes of IDEO, etc. And so I've always had a huge belief in the value of design. You know, you touched on this a little bit in the intro. Like, I believe that design has a huge business advantage. You know, it makes products easier to use, it makes them better. Often it's the reason why people switch from one product to another. And so I've long been an advocate of design. And one of the reasons I started my agency is because I could get good design into the hands of more people than just doing it myself. Off the back of my agency, I used to speak at a lot of conferences. I still do. I used to run conferences. And the reason I did this is because, you know, I can only design, 3 or 4 websites a year. My agency can maybe only design 10 or 20 or 30 products a year. But if I could kind of get rooms full of designers and product people and company owners interested in design, maybe we could, improve hundreds or even thousands. That's why I speak at conferences or I come on podcasts. About sort of 5 years ago, I come to the end of my agency journey. I sold the company. We actually made it employee owned, and I stepped into the world of VC. I do VC 2 days a week, and I do advising 2 days a week. And the people I advise are mostly heads, directors, and VPs of product and design. And a lot of the frustrations that they have when they come for coaching is that they have found themselves in organizations where they've been hired to do great design work, but the organization often doesn't really understand the value they bring or what to do with them. And so a lot of the coaching work I do with those founders is helping them tell a better story around design, expose the value of design, get their CTO, their CPO, their CFO, their CMO, all the C's on board, and really, really demonstrate how design isn't just like the sort of the nice airbrushing at the end of the process, but can actually deliver business value. And so a big part of my coaching is to do that. The problem is that most of the companies that these people work with are successful startups that didn't really have design baked in at the start. And so if you're a founder, you've gone from 0 revenue to 10 million revenue in the course of 3 or 4 years without design being particularly important. It's a harder, more uphill struggle for these design leaders to say, hey, look, you've been doing it all wrong, but now I'm here to solve all of your problems. And a lot of the time, the founding team will be like, who do you think you are? Get off your high horse. We've been doing pretty well without design, as a strategic partner for the last 3 or 4 years. Who are you to come in and tell us what to do? And so I realized that the best way to solve that problem, one way is obviously to help the design and product people to tell that story better, to equip them with better tools, which is why I do the coaching. But the other reason was, well, what if I can help those founders figure that stuff out in the early stages? So that's why I became a VC. And so I work for Seedcamp, who are a pre-seed and seed stage fund. They're one of the, regularly cited as one of the top 3 seed stage funds in Europe. We've got, I think, maybe 11 unicorn investments to our name, which is pretty good going for a European fund. And so when I work with founders, I'm working from day one. I'm working when they've just got a deck and an idea. And so when they're exploring their product market fit, when they're trying to get their first product, their MVP out of the door, when they're trying to shape their team, they will come to me and ask for my input and advice. And so my goal, hopefully, is obviously to make them as successful as possible. Because as the VC, my job is to try and invest in companies and then get a return. But I truly believe that one of the best ways of doing that is through design. I've seen companies take 3 years to get to product market fit where they could have taken 18 months if they'd had an understanding of user needs, if they'd have been really sensitive to kind of listening to their customers and hearing their frustrations. And so a lot of my work involves around helping support founders on their growth journey as they realize the value that design can bring.
Excellent. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting position as a VC. I don't know anyone else that fits that description that has the same approach. I've met with at least 100 now.
There were a few, just for the audience. I mean, so I've got a few friends. So my friend Irene Au was actually the very first designer at Google. So she's got a huge amount of input in Google, going from a purely engineering company to now hiring 1,000 designers. She went on to join Kozler Ventures, which are a big VC fund in the US. And she's pretty much like me. She's a kind of a partner at the fund focusing on design. About 6 or 7 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, Irene actually wrote a book for O'Reilly where she went out and interviewed all of the VCs that have a design background. And back then, there was about 30. So not many, but still a decent number. I'd say today there's probably about 50 or 60. Most of the designers who are working in VC are working at more traditional VC funds. I mean, again, another one is Jeff Veen, who was one of the founders of Adaptive Path. He's a great design sort of leader and thinker that works at a fund. You have actually started to see a few design focus funds. The classic one is the Designer Fund in San Francisco. And they have built a real ecosystem around design and investing. And, they don't just invest in products that are founded by designers, but they invest in founders that care about design. And obviously they've had really big investments, like Figma is one of their classic ones. You've also got Jake Knapp, who wrote the Sprint book. And, Jake and John have got a fund that is design focused. You've got Character VC, and you've got a few others. So, there's not a lot. I guess in an industry where there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of funds, there might be 3 or 4 design focused funds, and there might be 50, 60 design focused partners. I think we're in the minority when you compare it to the number of engineers that become VCs or product managers that become VCs. Or more commonly, a lot of VC world is still dominated by people who were ex-consultancy, who come from a legal or a finance background, because the hassle of setting up a fund is very legal and financial. But I strongly believe that the way you succeed is through product, and that's where us sort of product operators come in.
I very much agree. So you recently wrote a post pretty much about this, titled, "Everyone talks about product market fit. A good designer can help you find it." Where you kind of go through all this. So maybe the first question is, first of all, I would like you to just briefly go through like what is the point of the article, but also you say a good designer can help you find it. Should a good designer be one of the first hires you do as a startup?
I mean, there's 2 or 3 questions in there, which is really interesting, which I want to unpack. And so I'll start a little bit with what product market fit is. Product market fit is obviously finding a product and the right combination of features, function, behavior, design, technology that suddenly starts to click, suddenly starts to spark with the audience. Before you find product market fit, getting those people through the door, getting them to stick around is really slow going and really painful. The point at which you find product market fit is the point where everything starts to kind of catch a light. You can imagine, as a founder, you're there clicking a spark and building a pile of wood. But product market fit is the point where suddenly everything starts to kind of come alive. And I think a lot of founders understandably make the mistake that the reason people switch from their old solution, which might have been using another product, or it might have been using a whole combination of things. In the SaaS world, every company that's building a SaaS product is often building a nice front end to what was originally done with an Excel spreadsheet. And so a lot of the time when you're building a new product, you're trying to go, we're building something that's better than the old way. But is it good enough to make people switch? You might look at the Excel spreadsheet and go, well, that Excel spreadsheet is a bit rubbish and a bit ropey, but it's free and it's easy to use. And you suddenly put a whole bunch of features, a whole bunch of UI elements, you stick it behind a paywall, it suddenly gets more and more complicated. And so in order to make people switch their behavior, your product can't just be like a little bit better, marginally better. It has to be significantly better. And the first way that people do that is like, well, we're going to add new features. I'm going to go out as a founder. I'm going to talk to all my users about which features are missing. And I throw features at the problem. And then you add more capability and more capability and more capability. And every time you add a new feature, you think that this is going to be the one feature that is going to open up product market fit that's suddenly going to click. But weirdly, you find that whenever you launch a feature, there's a little bit of a bump in usage, there's a little bit of a bump in acquisition, but then it kind of goes back down to a flat level. And this is often because people aren't choosing your product on features alone. Often the reason people are wanting to switch for a product is because there's something wrong and broken and unsatisfying about the existing product. Maybe it takes a little bit too long to use. Maybe all the key features that you want are there, but they work in a really kind of ungainly way. Or maybe they're separated on 15 different screens or 3 or 4 levels deep. And in order to do the really simple thing you want to do every single day, you're using it and you're getting frustrated because you think the product should be able to do this in 2 minutes, whereas it actually takes you 20. And so a lot of the reason people switch products isn't because of a lack of features. It's because of the way those features have been combined in a really frustrating way. And often they were done that, they were combined in this way 10 years ago, because a lot of the time people are switching from old products, and they were often built by engineers who were purely focused on making sure that you had the capability of the product, but it wasn't easy to use. A lot of products I think are like Swiss Army knives, like really good to have a little toolkit. But if you ever tried to actually chop food with a Swiss Army knife, or worse, try and saw through a piece of wood, it doesn't do the job very well. Small blade, small handle, no traction. Whereas a great designer will say, well, how can I make the blade more effective? How can I make the handle more effective? How can I make it a more pleasant experience to saw through wood? And so I think this is where designers come in. I see a lot of founders that launch their product. They have this kind of, if you build it, they will come mentality, where they think people will just rush through the doors and start using the product. And then they get really frustrated when that doesn't happen. And they blame the customers, they blame the engineers, they blame everybody. But often what's happening is they're not really listening to what their users are saying. The users might be saying, I want this feature or that feature. But really, by watching the users use your product, you suddenly really quickly figure out what the problems are. Often it's a few simple things. Often the onboarding process is too slow and frustrating. So rather than getting through the sign up process and getting value in the first session, people have to come back a week later for a second or third session before they have all of the information that your product needs, they have all of the things connected. And that is a great opportunity for people to kind of get waylaid. You expect them to come back to the second or third session, but then they've got a busy deadline, they go back to using the previous tool that they were using or comfortable with, and they never come back. Or maybe they spend a whole session trying to use the product, but it takes them an hour or two to get the value. And designers are really good at figuring this out. Designers are really good at finding this frustration, going, hey, look, we need to get this value delivered in the first run. And maybe not just the first run, but in the first couple of minutes. If you are new to a product and literally within the first 5 minutes of using the product, you've gained value. You're like, oh man, I can see how this could be useful. And there's this kind of learning curve where it keeps giving value time and time again. You're much more likely to come back, irrespective of features. There is a little side element to this, which is there's a field, an emerging field of design called growth design. And where traditionally designers will look at adding new capabilities to a platform, growth designers are much more saying, well, hey, look, these are the capabilities we have, but how can we make these capabilities easier to access? How can we have those capabilities delivering value as quickly as possible? And they use all of their knowledge of empathy and human behavior and behavioral psychology in order to get that product working. And so what I see often is founders that are just taking if you build it, they will come, the next feature will solve all of my problems approach. It may take them 3 or 4 years to get to product market fit, because they're banging their head against a brick wall, hoping that something magically will happen. This whole idea of like, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. I think bringing designers on board, often they do challenge. I admit, like working with early stage designers can be a real pain in the ass for a founder, because the designer will question their assumptions and say, is this right? Are you thinking the right way? But very, very quickly, if those designers start delivering that value, if they start improving the experience, if people start sticking around for more, if the net dollar retention goes up, if the churn goes down, if all of the metrics start being hit, not through adding features, but for improving the experience, suddenly a light bulb pops over founders and you go, oh wow, I can see value here. And so I know there were 3 or 4 other questions baked into that, but I'll shut up for a second because that's the sort of the value of product market fit and why designers are really good at delivering it.
I enjoyed your new term, because I've never heard this before, growth design. And I think that's quite a valuable way of looking at it, because I've been in situations where I've been on an engineering team and design really is either the thing that comes before the building that doesn't get changed with all the other things to consider once the product is working, or it's the thing that comes after because the engineers have built a prototype in a really crude way and then it's designed afterwards. And rarely have I seen the growth design process that you're referring to. I think I would say that when I've worked in agencies, that does seem to be more of a thing, but it's still very much we are in a silo doing this user research and this information architecture exercise, and we're putting all these findings together and then we're passing them over to the engineering team, and then they are going to build and design the app how it should work, rather than that design team kind of providing more concrete recommendations for how that type of thing should manifest. And I guess I really, really think this approach is extremely valuable from how you're describing it. And I want to know if you've had any experience seeing this work firsthand, if you've seen any case studies, or has one thing really been magically manifested in terms of product market fit by taking this growth design approach?
Again, a bunch of really interesting things locked in there. I think for summation of the kind of design process, I think is how a lot of people see design. Designers go out, they do a bunch of research, they understand user needs, they gather requirements, they prototype it out, and then maybe 2 or 3 months later out pops a new feature. And actually, I quite, coming from an agency background, I quite like that kind of more considered approach. And I think if you're working in a very large company that already has an existing brand, you want to make sure that the features that you launch land. Because, if you've got millions of users and something doesn't work very well, that's problematic. If you have 10 users or 100 users, you don't really need to kind of over-engineer the design process, because it doesn't matter if you launch things and they don't land, you strip them out, you put something else in, no one's probably even noticed. Actually, in reality, I don't see your idealized view of the design process happen an awful lot. So if that's been your experience, I think that's wonderful. Because what I typically see is that a leadership team or a product management team decide on an idea based on either an executive, what the first thing that came to their mind to solve a problem, or what a customer said, or what their neighbor said, or what their next door neighbor said, or what the salesperson said, or we absolutely need X. And so you have a backlog of often poorly defined knee-jerk features that you think is going to be the next big thing that solves everything. And when you launch it, it doesn't. You do the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And often the designers are feeling quite frustrated because they want to do the process that you're suggesting. But actually what they end up doing is making a bad idea look nice, and then they hand that to the engineers, and the engineers then build a bad idea. And then you've spent, a few months on this thing that doesn't really have any value. You launch it, you forget about it. And then what happens is your product accretes complexity. Because every additional feature that you add that doesn't really end up having users but stays in the product just makes the product even more complicated. And so I think that is how most products are delivered today. But like I say, a lot of designers, a lot of traditional UX designers, they're very user focused, and they want to understand capabilities. They want to understand, what is my customer currently wanting to do that they're unable to do, and what new capability can I bake into the product that will allow them to do that. Now, this is great, but the problem with that kind of thinking, and this goes with product managers as well, is that the value that you deliver happens quite far down in the future. Like, you design the thing, you build the thing, you ship the thing, and then you hope at some stage somebody discovers it and they get value out of it. And so the designers that kind of tend to be attracted more to this growth design field, there are websites on growth design, there's a bunch of really amazing communities, there's lots of books around this space. They tend to be more experimental. They tend to be the kind of designers that can also maybe do a little bit of coding, because if they want to do an A/B test, if they want to throw up an experiment, often it's really hard to get these experiments into the backlog of your engineering team. And so as a growth designer, you need to be a little bit more self-contained. Also, growth designers typically don't work off the main backlog. The main backlog is, here's a feature, ship it. Growth designers tend to work with, like, here's a problem, we want to solve it. We have an onboarding problem and we want to get onboarding down, or we want to remove the drop off in the onboarding. And they're given an outcome. A lot of us designers talk about outcomes over outputs. Now, I would love a world where everybody in the product team was given an output, but that is not realistic. And so one of the reasons of having a growth team is you say, well, we're not going to make everybody outcome focused. But if we take a small little team of 2 or 3 people off the team of like 10 or 20 and have them focusing on outcomes rather than outputs, then we can still deliver all these features for our founders, but we can also then start solving these problems and making sure these things work. And a lot of, actually, interesting, I say, a lot of the mentality that comes with growth designers is your classic kind of agile, kind of lean startup. There's no point just launching a feature and letting it wither on the vine. You've got to iterate. And so we iterate and we test and we try things out, and we try some multivariate testing. We try different titles, different names, reducing the number of steps or whatever it is. And the goal is to kind of like every week almost be running 2 or 3 tests and getting something, one of those tests hopefully working. So what I advise to a lot of founders is, if you have maybe 3 product teams, if you're, maybe a little bit more like Series A, have one of those product teams focused on growth. Maybe you have a growth focused designer, maybe you have an engineer, maybe you have a writer or an analytics person, and you start your own little tiny growth team. If you're not there yet, if you've just got literally a single team, I still think you can kind of switch between sprints. Maybe you have 2 or 3 feature sprints or capability building sprints where you add new functionality into the product. But then maybe you have 1 sprint where you look about how you can then allow people to access that capability faster. A lot of this, actually, my book Over My Shoulder, The Growth Equation, is all about the sort of the first few years of startup growth. And one of the big arguments in my growth equation is time to value. And a lot of startups have the value there, but the time it takes to access that value is really slow. And one of the brilliant things about growth teams is they get that time down. Their whole goal is to make it easier and quicker and faster to get value. And if you get value quicker, you build these behaviors in. Like, if you start, the first time you use the product, you get value. You'll come back the next day, you get more value. You come back the third day, you get more value. After a week or 2 or 3 of using the product, you've cemented a new behavior. And this tool is now the product I use. Whereas if that value isn't there, then you drift away. And so I think growth design and growth teams in general are massively important, but it takes a more experimental mindset that a lot of designers, a lot of product managers, engineers don't have. And so, you sometimes need different kinds of teams with different capabilities.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I think like that version of design you talk about, that's very focused on narration. That's something we do a lot at Nordcraft. You said that it doesn't necessarily make sense for every part of your team. And I agree in the fact that outcome focus doesn't work for everything, because there will always be tasks that are like not specifically optimizing for an outcome, but either is somewhat upkeep or somewhat is requested features that we understand make sense and we have to satisfy a customer. There's always some percentage.
Let me clarify. Sorry, let me clarify something here, because maybe I misspoke, or maybe I didn't communicate it well. Like, I think the ultimate goal is to have independent product teams that you give them problems and they then go off and solve those problems. So I think that's the ultimate goal.
Okay.
But I think most founders want to be the ones that are coming up with solutions. I think most product people want to be coming up with solutions. And so what we have today is we have a group of people that go into a meeting room, solutionize, hand those solutions to the product team and tell those product teams to build them. And that change in culture is really hard. And I guess what I'm saying is that I don't think you can pull that bandage off in one go. I think if you've got 3 or 4 product teams who are working, I don't think you could just come in and change the whole culture and way of thinking of an organization by saying today, you as executives aren't allowed to have anything to do with coming up with solutions. You just give us the problems. So I guess ultimately what I'm saying is like the growth team often is a way that you can start experimenting with this mindset in a safe way. The founders still have a backlog. The still founders have their meetings and come up with all the solutions and hand it to the feature team. But you've got this little almost like Navy SEAL team that's slightly outside of that sort of backlog mindset. And they start delivering work. And suddenly the founders go, well, this team over here are doing really well. What are they doing? How are they doing this? Oh, this is a really interesting way in working. Maybe we could start rolling this mentality into some of our other teams. And they're going to be teams where maybe this isn't appropriate. Maybe you've got a platform team. Maybe the platform team is always going to be delivering from a backlog of features rather than a backlog of problems. But I think it's more around a transitional way of giving your team a little bit of like, an umbrella that you can have one team that goes off and does this new way of working. Without the founders feeling that now they've lost their pipeline of ability to ship whatever feature they want. And so, yeah, I think this is the ultimate goal but I think this is the first step on that process.
Yeah. I very much agree with it. I think and I like your approach of saying we're probably not going to be there in one go. I think a lot of times working with a founder can be a little bit like working with a client if you're an agency. Like they are very bad at explaining their problems. They always come up with features and then you have to work backwards to understand what the problem they were trying to solve and then see if you should probably solve it differently, right? I think both engineer or designer has been through this process.
Yep.
And I think I experienced
it's understandable. Again, like, founders have got limited resources, limited time. If you look at a problem and you go, oh, I know the solution, it's the first one that comes to your head, it's the most obvious solution, then of course you're going to say, well, just deliver that. Why are we going to waste time trying 5 or 6 different things? Why are we going to waste time having a meeting about this? This is clearly the solution. I've seen it work a dozen different times. Just do this. And we do this all in our own life, but what designers are really good at is they're good at not just accepting the first solution, but like you say, exploring the problem and going, okay, well, what are the other options here? What are some of the ways we can do these in slightly different ways? And actually, by taking a different approach, is this whole kind of like red ocean strategy, blue ocean strategy. The reason a lot of startups struggle is because they're operating in a red ocean where there's lots of competition. And the strategic logic is you need to pivot into a blue ocean. We need to do the same thing with features. If all you're doing is ever shipping the first most obvious feature, and that's the same features your competitors have, then all you're doing is you're following a competitor's roadmap and you're entering your product, making it more and more a red ocean product because it's just doing the same thing as everything else. One of the great things around design is they go, well, look, how can we solve this problem, but not in the most obvious way? Maybe in a really unusual way, but maybe it's that unusual way that suddenly everyone goes, wow, I've never seen this done like this before. Like I want to actually use this product because this product is different. I talk again in the book, I talk about like this idea of feature parity. Like if all you're doing is thinking of the most obvious solution, all you're doing is delivering feature parity, and nobody wins an arms race with feature parity. You need to zag when everyone else zigs. And I think designers are really good at that. We have this sort of mindset of not accepting the first idea that comes to us, but thinking of a dozen different ideas. And so, yeah, I think that's where design can come in, is looking for the non-obvious solution. This is creativity at its sort of finest, I think.
You kind of talk about this in your blog posts in terms of the missing style of thinking in the boardroom. So you talk about how there's 3 types of reasoning and only 2 usually makes its way to the boardroom. Can you explain a bit what you mean about this and what those 3 types are? Because I thought that was a really interesting point.
Absolutely. So yeah, there are 3 types of reasoning that we typically see. You've got deductive, inductive, and abductive. Now, deductive is the sort of the pure logic, the sort of the 1 + 1 = 2. You know, it's the logic that a lot of engineers use. Hard reason. Inductive is much more around looking at trends. It's looking at stats. It's a kind of the stuff that marketers and salespeople and founders often kind of use. But you then got this sort of slightly less understood sort of branch reasoning called abductive. And abductive reasoning is the ability to sort of take in and bathe in lots of information. And this information doesn't have an obvious answer. Like there's no, like with deductive reasoning, you suddenly see the blooded knife in the data and you go, well, this is clearly the sort of the murder weapon. And maybe in the inductive reasoning, you do a big survey of all the possible subjects and you find through data that this is the reason. With abductive reasoning, you're bathing this information and your subconscious process almost starts to kind of make connections. And it's this burst of insight, the eureka moment, that you go ahead and you go, oh, I think I understand this. And you come up with a solution. And it's only once you've come up with a solution, when you look back, you go, well, that was obvious. And it's one of these weird things, like designers are really great at coming up with things that post-rationalized, you go, well, we should have known that all the time. But it's not until you actually make that decision that that it becomes clear. And abductive reasoning is the kind of reasoning that most, crime TV shows use. Like you have all the evidence on the board and it's not really obvious, but suddenly the Sherlock Holmes figure kind of like goes, Eureka, I've figured it out. I've pieced all the items together and I now know the solution. And once the model is there, then it kind of feels obvious. And so I think businesses need to have a much more even balance of deductive, inductive and abductive reasoning. And I think designers are really, really good at that. I think one of the challenges, though, is designers often have quite low agency and quite low authority. And so often, and like I say, this sort of abductive reasoning often can feel a little bit timely, because why would we even bother to put all the clues on the board when our product manager says in their last company, they solved it this way? And it's like, well, that's great, but that worked for that company 3 years ago and it might not necessarily work now. So yes, Salma, you had a
So that
question.
was an excellent segue into the question I had lined up, in that I think what it might sound like you're describing a lot of the time when you're talking about how these designers are solving problems, they're experimenting, they are kind of leading the way in terms of forming the product and the UX. But I think a lot of the time what people might think that you're describing is the role of a product manager, in that here is what we need to do, here is what we need to solve, let's look at all these options, and then the product manager will kind of rally everyone together and say, you do that, and obviously provide solutions. So it's interesting that you mentioned the designers in this situation may have low agency, and it's the product managers that say what goes and what should be accepted and what people are working on next. And so it sounds like the role of a growth designer is actually what we know as a product manager. So is there still space for product managers, or do they have different roles? What's the difference? What's your take?
I mean, I've long been a believer on the sort of the product team trifecta. I think that designers, engineers and product managers should all be involved in the shaping of the product. And actually, each one of them brings a different set of background, a different set of skills. Like I say, maybe the engineer is more deductive, maybe the product manager is more inductive, maybe the designer is more abductive. And if they are all given a clear brief around what the goal of the company is, what the metrics they're trying to improve, etc., all of them can contribute in different ways. And there'll be certain contributions that the engineering team is just much better at doing. There's certain contributions that the product team is much better at doing. And there will be certain things that the designers are much better in doing. I am definitely not suggesting for a start that, hey, we could fire all of the product managers and everything would be fine if designers were leading the charge. But what I do think is designers have a unique perspective. They have a real unique understanding of user needs and frustrations, which often the rest of the organization doesn't. They often have the ability to think along first principles. what I tend to find is a lot of the rest of the organization, because they have such an awareness of how their market works, how their industry works, how their product works, is they are always looking through the lens of a super user. Whereas designers are often thinking, how does this feel the very, very first time that someone uses this product? Or they're often thinking, what happens when this goes wrong? Often, the engineer or the product manager will design the happy path, and maybe the happy path is perfect. But actually, you might find that the happy path only happens 20% of the time. And actually, it's all of the grungy, annoying, frustrating things. A lot of the time, I see products where, the language has been dictated by the founder because that's how they understand the model. But the people who are using the product understand things in a very different way. And there's often a tussle there. So I think that everybody has a useful part to play. Now, I am seeing more and more designers move into the realm of product, and I'm seeing a ton more product managers taking an interest in design. One of the biggest conferences in the UK, I think in the US as well, is Mind the Product. And Mind the Product has always been curated. When I've spoken at Mind the Product before, whenever I go to Mind the Product, I think, hey. Whenever I go to Mind the Product, I think this isn't really a product conference. This is a design conference. Like most of the people who are talking, even Marty Kagan, a god of product management, like most of the things he's talking about are trying to imbue product managers with a sort of a more designful kind of sense and understanding. And so I'm not saying that product managers can't do this, but I think if you have a mode of thinking, which is my job is to take requirements, deliver them in a particular time frame in an effective way, you maybe sometimes miss out on these sort of leaps of insight that designers can have. And so I think it's just about having a team and having a bit of a balance between different skills and disciplines.
Yeah. I kind of want a little bit circle back to the abductive reasoning, not to sort of derail anything going backwards, but one of the reasons why I find that concept of the way you phrase it so interesting, well, there's kind of two aspects. One of it is that I think a lot of times when you talk about it, like I'm almost hearing like that's what it likes to do a startup, right? Like the point of a startup is almost to go through this process. Like all the obvious solutions, the ones that are deductively easy to see, they've already been done. Like a large company will add them as a feature. The inductive one, when they have enough data, they will happen, right? The ones that are left, the really interesting ones, are the ones that, that aren't easy to see, that requires you to take a step back. And usually, and I think very importantly, requires you to not have a full backlog, right?
Yep.
Because what we see here, I like to say, is the best features we've added to Nordcraft was not on the backlog. They were procrastination. Like we had designers and engineers that was like, I'm going to do that thing, but I have this idea. I'm just going to try that out, right? And that led to like our new animation editor, which is one of the best features we have by far. Like it's such a game changer for us to be able to do. And that was just as because someone thought, hey, this is possible. This would be really interesting to see what actually happens if we try building this one.
Yeah. Well,
so I like that as a. No, go on.
Oh, I was just going to say, so there's a couple of really interesting things there. I think you're absolutely right. I think weirdly, a lot of startups succeed because almost like accidentally they build the product in a way that somehow clicks with customers, but they often don't really know how or why it does that. So it's like we're throwing loads of features and there's some combination of how these features have landed that is better. And often it takes maybe the founder 2 or 3 years to go, oh, now after watching all of our users use our product, the reason this product works well is because this combination of this feature, this feature, and this feature in this particular way delivers something that wasn't maybe intentional, but has worked really well. So this idea of emergent products, I think products often, and this is the whole point of the first 2 or 3 years, this is the search for product market fit is often an emergent process. If we knew exactly what would work, everyone else would have done it already. This is the idea that like if we had perfect knowledge in the stock market, no one would ever be able to make any money because everything would already be priced out. But there's often, often these weird errors or misunderstandings that kind of get into the system that take the product in a slightly different way that maybe wasn't intended, but suddenly everyone's going, oh, I'm really vibing on what you've done here, I think is really useful. So the thing I was going to say is there is a way of putting this into your process. there is the concept of the Kano model. I don't know if any of your audience or you may be aware of this, KANO. It's a sort of a product management kind of model, which sort of breaks down features into things that have got three different attributes. There are kind of threshold attributes, like things that absolutely have to be in the product for it to work. There are kind of performance attributes whereby the more of something you give, the better things are. And then there are these kind of delighter attributes where, you put a small thing in and it can have an outsized effect. And I'll give you a classic example, if you are designing a hotel room, you absolutely have to have a bed. If someone checks in and there's no bed there, then it's not a hotel room. So that's a threshold attribute. Your product absolutely has to have this. You might decide that these days it has to have a TV as well. But you might decide that the bigger the TV, with the more cable channels, the more happy the customer will be. And so maybe you decide to put a 72-inch screen and it's got free, video on demand and all this kind of stuff. That's a performance attribute. And these are the kind of things that engineering teams and product teams tend to focus on. They're easy, they're sizable, they're things that you can immediately kind of like scope and put into a backlog. But often there's something that hotels do which actually doesn't take an awful lot of effort. I stayed in one hotel room, whereas when the hotel turned around my room, they had a handwritten note on the pillow that said, "Hey, tomorrow it's going to rain. We've left you an umbrella." There are obviously the classic, hotel things of, leaving you chocolates on the pillow or, giving you a welcome bottle of champagne or whatever. Like, if you imagine what these things might be in terms of a product roadmap, these are often things that would get, ignored on a product roadmap. Take sort of old school Twitter, for example. Pull to refresh. You pull down, it bounces back with a really delightful kind of ping, and suddenly you get a whole bunch of new information. And you get to the one on the page and you pull to refresh and it does it again. Like, you're never going to see many product managers saying, "Hey, look, we would rather have this lovely little pull to refresh animation than having, additional characters or rich media or something else." And so a lot of the things that make the experience special get missed out of the backlog. And so this is the other reason why I actually think backlog shouldn't just be one undifferentiated kind of pool of stuff that you pull from, because some of the things that would make your product beautiful and amazing and memorable, are the things that get lost. And so actually, I think you should maybe have three different pools. Maybe you should have, a bunch of like absolute threshold things. We need this for it to work. You have a bunch of kind of like additional capabilities. And then you have a small little backlog, maybe one sprint in every quarter where you do something beautiful and delightful. Because often these are the things that people remember. These are the reasons people come back, a lot of the kind of the new generation of browsers, they're competing in a red ocean. But the browsers will have lovely little things that just make people's lives delightful, or calendaring apps, or email clients and to-do apps and whatever. And so, like, having the ability to kind of go from long-term, big thinking engineering performance to little delightful sprinkles, I think is really important.
Absolutely. I think it's especially because like there's been so much focus on, as you say, doing startups and companies in the blue ocean, right? That there's so many products that we use that we don't like. I keep coming back to LinkedIn as why hasn't someone made a better LinkedIn? Like it doesn't feel like it would be the hardest thing to do. Obviously, it's hard to get the customer base, right?
They tried to make another LinkedIn. Do you remember Polywork?
No.
Yeah. Well, they tried and it didn't work so well. Because I think they tried to add too many new features in the blue ocean that no one ever wanted. It was like, what creative, crazy stuff can we come up with that is different to what exists? But I think that you can go too far, right?
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, look, from my perspective, I think linear is an amazing example. Like you've got a whole bunch of ticket managing tools out there like Jira and Trello, and some people love them, but they're poorly designed and they're kind of technical. And hey, if you're a hardcore engineering team, maybe that's exactly what you want. But then along comes linear, And linear, the features that linear have are, probably very similar to Jira and Asana because there's a whole bunch of base things that you can do. But people love linear. The people who use linear go, I'm never going back to any of those other old school tools because they have been trained, all of their careers on smartphone apps, which are delightful to use, have got beautiful design, that are intuitive. Linear isn't winning because it has more features. Linear is winning because it's created an experience that the people who use it love. And no one's going around telling their friends, oh, you've got to use Jira, you've got to use Asana. But lots of engineers are saying, oh my God, you've got to switch to linear. Linear is delightful. And so this is what I'm talking about here. These are things that don't make it onto the backlog. And, there's no surprise that one of the reasons Linear have done that is because they were founded by a designer. They have built a beautiful designful product that's aimed at engineers, but is doing it in a really, really smart way.
Absolutely. So one of the, as you say, trying to get this style of thinking into the boardroom, because one of the things I find, the reason, or at least I think the reason why we see less of it is because with deductive reasoning, you reach a conclusion and you're fairly certain it's correct because, 2 + 2 is in fact 4, right? And in some abstract concepts, we might argue it's not, but generally when math is involved, it is 4, right? So if we do twice as much of something, we often get twice as much in return. And again, inductive reasoning, if it worked the last 5,000 times, there's a good chance it'll work now as well. And in both of that, you come up with an answer. But I would argue that the what's interesting about inductive reasoning is that you usually come up with a question and not an answer. You come up with a, should we try this? Or what happened if we do this? But it's only you have to always test. So you can never sit in a boardroom and saying, here's the solution. You can only say, here's an idea, right?
Yeah, there's very little certainty. This is why designers really struggle, because designers come in and say, hey, look, the way to solve this, you're saying with 100% confidence that this is the right way to solve it. And my way is to say, hey, well, why don't I go away for 2 weeks and noodle around and see? And if you're offered absolute certainty from an executive that, has got power and gravitas, and someone that's saying, I don't really know the answer, let me go away and have a play, you're going to go naturally with the one that has that certainty. One of my coach, sort of things I do with a lot of founders, a lot of designers, is trying to make them come across in the boardroom with a lot more certainty. I kind of joke, how many designers does it take to screw in a light bulb? Well, first we need to do a 6-month study on the role of light in society. This is a lot of designers, a lot of people that work with designers get really frustrated because every answer to every question is well, I need to go away and check this. And you're like, no, we know we need a light bulb. But so I think designers need to get better at kind of playing that corporate game and being certain and but also getting small wins and building on those wins. If you can show, if you can prove that your thinking has improved onboarding speed or retention or whatever, suddenly you'll get more buy-in from your bosses to say, hey, well, the thing that you suggested worked last time, let's try that thing again. And particularly if it's not going to slow things down. So I think you're right. It's a real challenging one. What I find, and this again, not to plug the book too much, but this is one of the things I kind of talk about a lot in the book. And as I said earlier in the conversation, as a founder, you want to go fast, and anything that feels like slowing down, you want to avoid. And so if you're absolutely certain that something is going to be the right answer, you're going to go with it. The problem is that the market is constantly changing. The environment is constantly changing. So what worked 2 or 3 years ago might not work now. You might have found that cold email outbound was perfectly fine 3 years ago in your last company. And so you're going to carry on doing cold email outbound. But the market's changed and suddenly everyone's on board. And maybe you need to start doing clever things with LinkedIn voice, like voice notes or whatever. The places where I'm finding startups get traction isn't by doing exactly the same thing as everyone did 10 years ago. It's by trying something new that no one's done before. And everyone goes, oh, wow, I didn't realize, and LinkedIn voice memos now are about a year or two old. So they're probably tailing off. But I remember a year ago, people going, I'm getting a 20% response rate with my LinkedIn voice memos, and I'm getting a 2% response rate with my LinkedIn direct emails. I'm going all in on voice memos. And I'm sure there's some other kind of thing that's happening now. The exact same thing is there with kind of features. So I get it. What happens though, and this is going back to my previous thing, founders need to scratch their own itch. So I don't think that designers should try and talk founders out of a course of action. As a VC, I don't try and talk founders out of a course of action. If a founder says, this is my vision for the product, this is what I'm going to try, whether it's a feature set, whether it's a go-to-market strategy, whatever, then my job is to analyze that and go, okay, well, look, I think these are some of the challenges. I think you might find that like this doesn't work now, or this is a little bit off or whatever, but this is your company, you go for it. And what happens is they do it, and then it doesn't land. And then it doesn't land. They go, oh, Andy told me this wasn't going to work. I should have listened to Andy. Let me go back and see what Andy's got to say about how we might do this differently. So it's almost like, I know a lot of parents that, consistently try and tell their kids to behave in a certain way. And if you keep doing that, actually, they're going to deliberately not behave in that way just to piss you off. Don't go and pet the dog. And they go and pet the dog and the dog growls at them and they get freaked out. And then they realize maybe mum and dad was right and they shouldn't have petted the dog, or, don't touch the hot plate. I think you've got to let founders go with their gut feeling, because actually probably 70, 80% of the time it will work. But the 20% of the time it doesn't. You're there to say, hey, look, we can figure this out. I want to help you here. Let's try something different. And so this is my feeling. Like, I think a lot of founders get into this trough of disillusionment where they've launched, they expect a whole ton of money. They've got, 18 months to get to $1 million ARR and Series A, but nothing they are trying is working. And they keep trying the same thing over and over again and it's not working. And that's the point where you've got to wait for those founders to get to the point of like, oh, I realize this behavior isn't working. I realize that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is the classic definition of insanity. I now need to accept that and go to the people in my network, maybe the VCs, maybe my designers, maybe my engineers or product managers, and say, what am I doing wrong? The irony is that when I talk to kind of in-house teams, most of the teams already know why the product isn't working. Usually the founder is the last one to realize this. And my job is to help them realize it as quickly as possible and help them realize that there are other people out there that have an idea of how they can solve that, leaning into that quickly. And if you can do that, you can get product market fit down from 3 years to 18 months. And that's all I want to do. Like, if I can get every person I work with, every founder I work with, every person that reads my book, they can get PMF down from 3 or 4 years to 18 months to 2 years. That saves them a lot of hardship. That saves us a lot of money. That means that more and more companies will thrive, and that can only be a good thing.
Makes sense. We're coming up to time, and so I'm going to wrap up with this. So what it sounds like you're advocating for really is just great communication between the different functions of people in a team. Take a mature approach. Everyone should be able to use their best skills that they're hired for in the job. And so technically, really what it sounds like, it needs a cultural shift, because we know the industry doesn't really work like that. And so is that the biggest change you want to see in the industry with regards to design, that cultural shift, or is there something else that needs to happen first?
I mean, I think on a very simplistic level, I'd say yes. But I think realistically, what I'm actually talking about, like, the cultural shift isn't just about hiring people and letting them do their job. I think the real cultural shift is a realization that we are solving problems rather than shipping solutions. If all we do is come up with the first most obvious solution and put it into production, and then do that again and again, we're going to find that we're delivering a red ocean product. If instead of having a backlog of solutions, we have a backlog of problems to solve, and each time we look at that backlog and say, what is going to be the most effective way to solve this? And then I have a hypothesis, and then I test that hypothesis. And then, does that hypothesis work? Great, put it into production. If it doesn't work, ditch it, try my next hypothesis. All I'm really actually advocating for is, the lean startup methodology and taking a more scientific approach to product management. And, this is stuff that we've been talking about for the last 10 or 20 years. None of this is rocket science. But the number of people that I see that talk about doing agile, but don't actually do it, mini waterfall. The people that talk about doing lean startup and then launch, fire and forget. All I'm saying is, like, what is the problem? What do we think the most likely solution is? Let's try it. If it didn't work, strip it out, try the next thing. And that is the only way to do this. And I guess the difference is, like, when I'm talking about like this 18-month process versus 3-year process, the problem with the 3-year process is people do this, but they launch a product, they launch a feature. 18 months later, they go, well, that hasn't worked. I'm going to try something different. They are still doing this, but the learning cycles are 18 months long, where they could be a sprint length, 2 sprint lengths. And the way, as we all know in the startup world, we give a good talk, the way you get better is you ship faster and you learn quicker. And this is all about learning. And if, as a product manager, as a founder, I only learn in 18-month blocks, if I only learn at the state of every single raise, I'm not learning fast enough. If I can learn whether my product is working, if my feature is working in a month or a week or a day or an hour, that is how you get this exponential growth. And so that's all I'm kind of suggesting, really.
Having a backlog of problems rather than solutions does sound like a scary thing to launch yourself into, but that's the way to do it, according to Andy Budd. Thank you so much for the conversation today, Andy. Where can people find you and see your stuff on the internet?
Well, back in the day, I would have said Twitter, but Twitter's gone in a slightly odd direction. I'm still there, but I'm not really active. But you can find me more active on Blue Sky. It's more social on Blue Sky. I'm just Andy Budd on Blue Sky. Or it feels like LinkedIn has taken over a lot of the other social media for professional stuff. So I'm just Andy Budd on LinkedIn. Or just come by andybud.com, or, my Medium, the Design VC and the Design Coach on Medium, and I talk about coaching and VC stuff, under each different brand.
Thank you so much. Go check out Andy, go check out his work, his book, everything. Andreas, do you have any last words to see us off?
I just want to say thank you so much for doing this, Andy. I met you like a couple of years ago first, and we had a great conversation that lasted, I think, much longer than we allotted time for. And I'm so excited that you wanted to come do the podcast with us.
I loved meeting you at Tech Barbecue, I think it was, and had a great chat. And I'm really, really excited with what you're all doing. So thank you so much for spending time with me.
Thank you so much. And we will see you next time on Pixels with Purpose.